Biology. Today we're going to keep going with descent with modification. We're going to talk about some pieces of evidence for evolution. First thing we need to make sure we understand is that the age of the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. And at the beginning it was very hot, very rocky. There was no liquid water. The atmosphere was thin and mostly hydrogen and helium. So we're really developing at that point, developing our core and trying to stabilize. Eventually, the Earth did cool, so the gases escaped to form the atmosphere. So we had water vapor, we had nitrogen, which is a majority of our atmosphere, methane, ammonia, and carbon dioxide. All those great things in the atmosphere. Now, water vapor eventually condensed and it formed rain. This created a little bit of a hot and humid climate. The oceans did form. Then we ended up having some volcanic eruptions, which added more gases to the atmosphere. Okay, so a lot of cool things happening on the Earth there. And then a couple of other major things that occurred. About 3.8 billion years ago, we find our first life. Bacteria were unicellular organisms that were found in the oceans that eventually developed into photosynthetic bacteria. This photosynthetic bacteria used photosynthesis, which created oxygen as a byproduct as it broke down water, and that got released into the atmosphere, which paved the way later for organisms to go on land. One of the other major things has been several multicellular organisms that were able to survive on land. We had plants and animals that did those things. We had mass extinctions that occurred over that occurred often, and we really think the humans first came around about 100,000 years ago. Are we driving the next mass extinction with all of our global warming? The fossil record is probably one of the bigger pieces of evidence besides the amount of time and what we know how long things take to change. The fossil record does preserve several remains. They can be found in sedimentary rock. Fossils can have indentations in the rock, and they can show you forms and structures. What we find is that there are several organisms in the fossil record that look very similar to organisms that we have now. Okay, maybe slightly different. Remember, we talked about descent with modification. Okay, so fossils can tell us ages. They can tell us morphology, which is the shape of organisms, maybe how they moved, how they ate, behaviors of what they did. So where were they found? Were they found around crushed rock? Does that mean that they stay in one area? Do we find them around footprints? What was their gait? All those things can be figured out from the fossil record. So again, the fossil record is very simple, very easy. Kind of what we're looking at here is a picture of what the rock layers would look like. Older fossils will be found at the bottom, meaning that they're older, or found first. And the younger fossils will be found nearer the surface. What we know about how soil is put together, dead materials at the top, older materials at the bottom. So it gets compacted towards the bottom of the rock layers there. So younger organisms or newer organisms are found at the top. Older organisms are found at the bottom. So another piece of evidence is similarities in embryo development and body structure. So here's kind of a cool picture. This is essentially the fish, salamander, tortoise, chicken, pig, cow, rabbit, and human all at the first stage of embryonic development. What we see is that all these organisms are very, very similar. Okay, so they start to diverge a little bit later. Okay, so we start to see some very characteristic shapes in the fish and the salamander, but the tortoise, the chicken, the pig, the cow, the rabbit, and human still look fairly similar going forward. Not until stage 3 in embryonic development do we see some organisms that are, really starting to take shape. But notice how the mammals, in this case, the pig, the cow, the rabbit, and the human, are all very, very similar to each other at this particular stage. So this idea here talks about common ancestors. Okay, if we're all developing very similarly from a vertebrate standpoint, then that tells us that we came from a common ancestor. This is one of the pieces of evidence for descent with modification. Now, the next part in similarities is called body structures. We have two terms that we're going to learn here. The first one is called homologous structures. Okay, so you see a picture over here of a human, the cat, the whale, and the bat. Each one of them have similar bone structures here. We see the humerus, the radius, and the ulna. Then we see the carpal bones and the metacarpals of the hand. Each organism has each one of those. Those are called homologous structures. They are the same for each one. Now, next we have what are called vestigial structures. Okay, these are reduced versions of what may have been in other organisms very essential. Right now, what we have is an example of a human appendix here. The human appendix itself is not really used right now for what we know of, so it's a very reduced structure. That's kind of what a vestigial structure is, a reduced version of a certain body structure. Okay, another good example of that is a whale bone. For those of you that saw the video yesterday, we talked about the whale bone actually having, or the whales having actually a pelvis itself. This is actually a very reduced structure. They don't really have this right now, but you can see that their tail flows back here. So the tail was not their legs at any point. The tail is just a developed structure this way. This is the pelvis. This is where, theoretically, in their evolutionary point, they lost their legs coming off of this point here. Okay. The last piece of evidence for evolution that we'll talk about today is molecular evidence. We see lots of times where humans and other organisms have very similar structures. If they have similar biological structures, or biochemical structures, excuse me, such as DNA, RNA, and how they make proteins, then we can safely assume that they have a common ancestor. Okay, so in this case we have mouse and we have humans. We see very similar structures on what we have for X and Y, for the sex chromosomes, for how things occur, but as we discussed in our own activities, we discussed how chimpanzees and gorillas and even a hypothetical common ancestor all have very similar hemoglobin DNA structures. This itself is another example of how common ancestors are found. So, to reiterate, 4 ways that we have evidence for evolution. First one is the biological time frame, how old the Earth is, what we know about how long evolution takes. Since it takes a long time, the Earth has been around a long time. So there's plenty of time for evolution to occur. The second one we talked about was the fossil record, how we have plenty of evidence of organisms that have already been around, and those organisms look very similar to organisms that we have now, not exactly the same in some cases. So this gives us the idea that we have similar organisms, so they must have descended with a little bit of modification. Okay. The third one that we discussed was similarities in embryo development and similarities in body structures. Talked about 2 terms there. Homologous structures, which are structures that might be slightly different, might be used for slightly different things, but have similar anatomies. The other one is a vestigial structure, which is a structure that may have been used similarly, but is no longer used that way and is even a reduced structure. And the final thing that we talked about here was molecular evidence. We discussed that with our chimpanzees, but this is also another example here with mouse and human, where we have similar structures found on similar places. And what we find is that molecular evidence shows us that common ancestors probably were the best way of passing on and descending with modification because we have such similar DNA. Okay? Thank you very much.